In the midst of a violent storm, Lucy felt her stomach twist as a blood-soaked bobcat tore through her door. She had no idea the horror pursuing it would force her to fight for both their lives. Lightning split the sky above the remote cabin, revealing a jagged silhouette against the swirling storm clouds. Rain hammered the tin roof in a relentless tattoo, and the wind rattled the window panes with each thunderous crash. Inside, Lucy Harding gripped the edges of her worn quilt, her heart pounding from the sudden jolt that seemed to shake the very foundation of the old house. Normally, storms in this part of the countryside were no cause for alarm, but something about this night felt ominous, as though the tempest carried secrets on the howling wind. She rose from her armchair and made her way to the front window, her boots clacking on the hardwood floor. When lightning illuminated the darkness, she glimpsed the forest beyond the clearing, towering pines swaying like desperate dancers in the gale. Lucy's family had owned this property for generations, and she considered herself well accustomed to nature's tantrums. Still, an unshakable tension coursed through her veins, making her nerves hum like overdrawn wires. Lightning flashed again, and Lucy froze. Amid the shadows, she thought she spotted a pair of reflective eyes at the tree line, but they vanished as fast as they appeared. Shaking off a prickle of fear, she turned from the window and double-checked the lock on the front door. In the kitchen, she set a kettle on the stove to prepare tea, hoping the gentle ritual would calm her swirling thoughts. The kettle had barely begun its low hiss when a sharp sound yanked her attention toward the back of the house. It was a scraping of claws against the wooden boards of the porch, followed by a high, piercing yowl. Lucy's pulse quickened. She knew the local animals, raccoons, possums, the occasional fox. But this cry sounded fiercer, more desperate. Bracing herself, she took up her flashlight and stepped cautiously toward the mudroom, where the back door led out into the wind and rain. The storm howled louder with each step, as if warning her to stay inside. She opened the door a crack, shining the flashlight into the roiling darkness. Sheets of rain made it almost impossible to see. Then the beam caught a flash of movement near the bottom step, a hunched figure, all fur and wiry limbs, pacing erratically. The creature dashed forward and collided with the screen door in a flurry of wet fur. Lucy stumbled back, her flashlight shaking. In the glare of the light, she recognized the distinct tufted ears and spotted coat. A bobcat, soaked to the bone, eyes blazing with terror. Under any other circumstance, Lucy would have slammed the door and locked it. Wild bobcats did not make friendly houseguests, especially in the midst of a storm. But the animal's desperation radiated off it like heat, and its ragged flank glistened with fresh blood. Lightning flared once more, illuminating the yard behind the cat. Lucy's breath caught at the sight of something else. A dark shape slinking through the pines, its eyes glowing, its outline massive. Whatever stalked the bobcat was bigger and more dangerous than anything she'd encountered. A surge of adrenaline roared through her. The bobcat clawed at the door, casting frantic glances back at the yard. Lucy hesitated. Welcoming a panicked predator inside her home seemed insane, yet letting it remain outside, wounded and hunted by that monstrous silhouette, felt even worse. Her heart hammered as she reached for the screen door handle. With a swift pull, she let the bobcat bolt in, splattering droplets of water and blood across the porch. No sooner had Lucy shut the door than something slammed against it from outside, hard enough to rattle the hinges. She pressed her shoulder against the door, breathing in shallow gasps as the bobcat hissed behind her. Through the mudroom window, she glimpsed that hulking shape circling the house, methodically testing every corner. A low growl reverberated through the storm, sending a chill along her spine. The bobcat crouched, ears pinned, ready to defend itself if Lucy made a wrong move. She slowly turned to face it, trying to keep her own fear in check. Blood dripped from a gash on the animal's flank, and a ragged patch of fur stood straight up along its back. Something had taken a swipe at it, likely with massive claws. Suddenly, a lightning flash revealed that the cat wore a battered collar, barely visible beneath the wet fur. Lucy's mind spun. A collar might mean it was once in someone's care. Could it be part of a research project, or had it escaped from a wildlife sanctuary? Before she could puzzle further, another heavy crash reverberated from outside. The doorframe groaned under the impact. Lucy feared it might give way if the attacks continued. The bobcat let out a strangled yowl, torn between its instinct to flee and the knowledge that it faced an even deadlier foe out there. Summoning an odd surge of resolve, Lucy stepped away from the door and carefully maneuvered around the terrified cat. Despite its tense posture, it allowed her to pass. She locked the inner mudroom door that led to the main house, flipping the latch before hurrying back to the kitchen to grab whatever she could for first aid. She returned with antiseptic, gauze, and a thick towel, uncertain how she'd managed to treat a wild bobcat that might turn on her at any moment. Yet as she knelt a careful few feet away, the cat fixed her with a desperate stare. It almost seemed to understand that she wanted to help. "Easy," Lucy murmured, sliding the towel toward the cat first. It sniffed at the offering, teeth bared, but made no move to attack. Inch by inch she approached, finally pressing the towel against the cat's bleeding flank. The creature hissed, but did not swipe. Lucy poured antiseptic on gauze, her hands trembling. Carefully she dabbed at the wound. Each time thunder clapped, the bobcat flinched, eyes darting to the door as if expecting that unknown predator to burst through at any second. A sudden gust rattled the windows, followed by a series of scraping sounds on the outer walls. Lucy felt her stomach twist at the realization that the thing outside was roaming the perimeter, searching for a weak spot. Whatever lurked in the night, it wanted the bobcat badly enough to challenge the barrier between wilderness and human habitation. The battered collar, the savage slashes, something strange was at play. Lucy tucked a strand of damp hair behind her ear, forcing herself to remain calm for the cat's sake. She needed to think, needed a plan. If the intruder managed to break in, she had no idea how to protect herself or the injured animal. Her phone lay on the kitchen counter, but the storm had knocked out the power lines earlier in the evening, and cell reception here was notoriously poor. She was alone, barricaded with a wounded predator, while something far more menacing prowled just outside. Lightning flared again, exposing a looming shadow near the back window. Lucy's breath caught. The shape stood upright for a moment, impossibly large, its movements fluid yet unsettling. Then it sank down and slunk out of sight. The bobcat released a low, guttural moan, as if it sensed the same uncanny danger Lucy did. Her gaze fell on the collar again, its worn edges and faint lettering just visible in the dim light. She'd have to inspect it more closely when the cat was calmer and the immediate threat had passed. Then came another tremendous thud at the mudroom door. The wood splintered near the hinges, and a gust of rain blew into the small space. The bobcat scrambled backward, hissing fiercely. Lucy felt her heartbeat pound in her ears as she realized the door wouldn't last much longer. They were out of time. She swallowed hard, bracing herself against the sensation that her entire world had shrunk to this one terrifying storm, this one wounded creature, and the savage presence determined to claim it. Lucy scrambled to the mudroom and pressed her back against the splintering door, feeling the weight of the intruder slam again. Beneath her hand, the wood gave another dangerous crack, each blow from outside threatening to tear the hinges free. Rain seeped through the fractured frame, puddling on the floor as thunder shook the foundation. The wind whipped inside, making the single overhead bulb flicker ominously. She glanced over her shoulder at the bobcat, which paced in a tight circle, hackles raised. Another crash rattled the door and Lucy clenched her teeth. If she couldn't find a way to brace the entrance, that monstrous shape would barge in. Heart hammering, she seized a nearby chair and wedged it against the handle, hoping it would hold at least for a few seconds. Her mind raced with questions she couldn't yet answer. Why was this bobcat collared? What on earth was that creature stalking them? She remembered glimpses of talon-like claws in the lightning's glare, and how it seemed to tower even in a crouch. The rational side of her brain insisted no predator native to these woods matched that description, yet her eyes had not lied. The bobcat's frantic attempt at escape made it clear it faced something beyond a mere territorial squabble. Lucy forced herself to breathe evenly, to think of a plan. She had an old hunting rifle stashed in the hall closet, passed down from her grandfather, but the last time she fired, it had been ages ago. Nevertheless, it might be their only chance if the invader broke through. With the door groaning, she turned toward the hallway, hoping her shaky hands would remember how to load and aim in a crisis. Lightning ripped across the sky once more, revealing the intruder's silhouette through the cracked glass. Lucy swallowed hard, glimpsing a massive shoulder and an elongated muzzle, neither canine nor feline. The storm wind howled, flinging branches against the windows like frantic hands. Her boots slipped on the wet floor, and she nearly lost her balance, but adrenaline drove her onward. Behind her, the bobcat cried again, a strange mix of pain and fear that sent goosebumps prickling down her arms. She threw open the closet door and rummaged through a jumble of tools, coats, and boxes until her hand closed around cold steel. The rifle emerged, its wooden stock nicked and scuffed. A second search yielded a small container of rounds. Fumbling them into the chamber, she tried to keep her trembling under control. Thunder boomed again, rattling the entire house like a giant knocking at the walls. Returning to the mudroom, rifle in hand, Lucy saw the door beginning to give way near the latch. Splinters jutted out and rain sprayed through the widening gap. She braced the butt of the rifle against her shoulder, squinting through the dimness. If the thing outside finally broke down the door, she would have to be ready to fire without hesitation. The bobcat huddled in one corner now, shaking from cold, injury, or both. Lucy inched sideways until her back was against the wall, giving her a clear shot of the doorway. She steadied herself, remembering half-forgotten lessons about stance, breath control, and trigger squeeze. Another crash split the night. The doorknob popped free, clattering onto the soaked porch. Lightning flared again, and she glimpsed a massive arm, or foreleg, shoved violently against the crumbling wood. The chair she'd wedged let out a groan, sliding inches across the floor. Lucy's finger tightened on the trigger. She tried to steady her breathing, but every thunderclap jolted her already raw nerves. At last, the final splinter gave way. The door banged open, torn half off its hinges. Rain and wind surged in, scattering leaves and debris across the floor. In the near darkness, Lucy made out the vague shape of something entering. Broad, powerful, a nightmare of muscle and fangs. She couldn't discern its full outline yet, but she saw eyes reflecting a sickly glint in the flicker of lightning. Summoning every scrap of courage, Lucy squeezed the trigger. The rifle's report echoed like cannon fire, momentarily drowning out the storm. The recoil slammed into her shoulder, and sparks illuminated the confined space with shocking brightness. She heard a terrifying roar, followed by a frenzied crash as the creature staggered back into the darkness. For a few seconds, Lucy's ears rang too loudly to hear anything else. She forced herself to remain poised, rifle still raised in case it came back. Rain lashed the porch, and the battered door banged against the jamb. Her lungs burned from holding her breath. Finally, she exhaled and took a trembling step forward. The wind carried the smell of gunpowder, blood, and wet earth. Lightning illuminated the yard, revealing no sign of the creature, only scattered footprints that trailed into the shadows. A low groan came from the collapsed door, but no further attack followed. Lucy edged onto the porch, rifle at her shoulder, adrenaline pounding in her veins like liquid fire. She shone her flashlight into the rain, scanning for movement among the dark pines. Nothing. Only the relentless downpour and the ghostly flicker of branches in the wind. At last, Lucy retreated indoors, securing the broken door as best she could by wedging it shut with spare planks and the battered chair. She doubted it would withstand another assault, but for now it had to do. The Bobcat was crouched beneath a table, eyes wide and wild. With the immediate threat gone, Lucy felt the shaking in her limbs take over. She sank onto her knees, gasping for breath, letting the rifle rest on the floor. She glanced at the Bobcat, noticing how its injured flank bled. Every so often, it lifted its head toward the door, ears perked, waiting for the next sign of that nightmare. Lucy felt a pang of empathy. This wild creature, battered and collared, had run into her life seeking refuge from something far more dangerous than the storm. Lucy stayed on her knees for a long moment, trying to still the trembling in her arms and legs. Her breath came in shallow gasps, and each pulse of lightning made her flinch. The wind roared around the house as if it were an enraged creature in its own right. After what felt like an eternity, she managed to draw a deep, steadying breath. Her gaze flicked to the Bobcat beneath the table. Its pale eyes tracked her every movement, sharp with uncertainty. She wondered if the gunshot had hurt its sensitive ears, or if the cat sensed her own palpable fear. Outside, the storm pounded at the walls and roof, but the house remained, at least for the moment, intact. Lucy glanced at the broken mudroom door, half aware that she had to block it more effectively. The last thing she needed was for that monstrous intruder to try again, yet the thought of stepping outside to secure anything felt impossible. If it lurked just beyond the meager protection of these walls, Lucy would be defenseless a second time. She reminded herself that her shot had made it retreat, or at least wounded it enough to buy some time. Slowly, she rose to her feet and placed the rifle on a nearby chair, keeping it within arm's reach. The house felt colder, with the wind shrieking through the ragged gap in the doorway. She fetched a pile of towels and old blankets from a trunk in the adjacent hall, stuffing them into the gaps in a crude attempt to block the worst of the rain and wind. Each time thunder rattled the windows, Lucy's heart jolted anew, adrenaline surging at the memory of that colossal shape forcing its way in. When she was satisfied that no immediate gusts would tear the door from its final hinge, Lucy turned back to the Bobcat. It crouched in the same spot, droplets of water still clinging to its matted fur. Its sides rose and fell in quick, shallow breaths, and the gash on its flank oozed dark blood onto the floor. She realized if she didn't do something, the cat might bleed out or develop a severe infection. But the idea of tending to such a wild creature without sedatives or professional help made her queasy. She knew the nearest veterinarian's office was miles away, and in this storm, driving the narrow, unpaved roads would be perilous. Even if she managed to reach the old jeep parked beside the house, she doubted it could traverse the muddy lanes without getting stuck. The local ranger station was too far for her to attempt on foot. Her only option, it seemed, was to do the best she could on her own. The cat let out a low rumble when Lucy approached with a bowl of lukewarm water. Her stomach knotted, but she forced herself to maintain a calm demeanor. Instinct told her the Bobcat could sense her fear, and any sudden movement might provoke a defensive strike. She inched closer, speaking softly, even though the cat likely understood none of her words. Its ears twitched at the sound of her voice. After a moment's hesitation, she set the bowl down and backed away, giving the animal space to drink if it chose to trust her offering. Next, Lucy retrieved the first aid supplies she'd gathered before the confrontation. The antiseptic bottle gleamed in the flickering light overhead, making her think of how fragile the barrier was between safety and chaos. She knelt slowly, turning her body sideways so as not to appear threatening. The Bobcat watched, tense but unmoving. When she extended the damp cloth to dab at the wound, it growled in warning, yet still did not lash out. Carefully, Lucy pressed the cloth to the cat's side, wincing at the fresh surge of blood that stained the fabric. She spoke softly, murmuring reassurance to both herself and the Bobcat as she cleaned the laceration. Between thunderclaps, she heard the cat's ragged breathing and her own unsteady heartbeat. She remembered reading somewhere that bobcats, like many predators, could withstand injuries that would cripple a smaller animal. She had to hope that was true. This wound looked deep, but if it hadn't hit any vital organ, the cat might recover with time and proper care. As she worked, Lucy caught another glimpse of the collar hidden beneath soaked fur. Her curiosity flared. Most wild bobcats wouldn't wear such a thing unless they'd been captured and tagged by wildlife biologists. She gently slid her fingers beneath the leather strap, careful not to tug on the cat's neck. Beneath the layer of mud and tangled hair, she felt raised letters, maybe an identification code or a research station label. She couldn't make out the writing in the poor light, and the bobcat squirmed when she tried to angle it. Deciding not to push her luck, Lucy withdrew her hand and focused on wrapping the wound instead. Outside, the thunder receded slightly, but the heavy rain continued. The relentless downpour drummed against the tin roof like an army of small fists. Lucy glanced at the window. The sky remained pitch black, no sign of dawn. She felt a pang of helplessness. She wanted to call for help, to have someone else confirm that everything would be okay, that the battered door and the giant footprints would fade into a bad memory by morning. But the storm likely took out the phone lines for the night, leaving her isolated in the darkness. At last, she managed to secure a bandage around the bobcat's flank. It was a rough job, likely not up to veterinary standards, but it would stem the bleeding. Exhausted, Lucy backed away, letting the animal have its space. She sank onto a small stool by the wall, arms limp at her sides. After a few minutes, she noticed the cat's eyes drift shut, its body finally giving in to exhaustion. She couldn't tell if it slept or had simply lapsed into a state of uneasy rest, but for now, it was calm. Her own body cried out for rest too, but she refused to let herself fall asleep, not with the storm raging and that unknown terror still out there. Every so often, she heard a creak or a scrape beyond the sodden yard, and she would jolt upright, heart hammering. Yet no new attacks came, and the drumming of the rain had a strangely hypnotic pull. Eventually, she noticed a faint trickle of light creeping under the clouds. Dawn was coming. Lucy wasn't sure what the new day would bring. The intruder might still be lurking in the woods, or it might have fled far away, wounded by her shot. The bobcat's condition could improve or turn dire at any moment, and on top of those immediate worries, there was the lingering mystery of the collar around its neck. Before she could begin to unravel that puzzle, she'd need daylight, stable weather, and maybe a chance to reach someone else, anyone who could help her piece together what had really happened here tonight. The sky was a bruised purple when the faint light of dawn finally breached the storm clouds, revealing the battered state of Lucy's property. Twigs and branches littered the yard, and deep puddles glimmered in the early light. The rain had dwindled to a persistent drizzle, allowing her a clearer view of the damage. She stood by the main room window, rifle balanced against the wall, watching the uneven shapes outside and bracing herself for any sign of the creature's return. Behind her, the bobcat stirred. It lifted its head and sniffed the air, clearly disoriented. The bandage Lucy had wrapped around its flank appeared soaked from the night's ordeal, and she suspected she would have to replace it soon. She half expected the bobcat to lash out or bolt for the door, but instead it remained curled in the corner, ears pricked warily. The edges of its collar gleamed in a stray beam of dawn's light, prompting Lucy to wonder again how it had come by such a thing. Lucy headed over to the window near the mudroom, stepping carefully where water still pooled on the floor. The makeshift barricade she'd assembled was warped and sodden. She could see the tattered door, clinging to the frame, riddled with deep scratches and gouges. In the grey morning light, those claw marks looked even more sinister, as though something impossibly strong had raked across the wood in a fit of rage. She bit her lip, recalling the massive outline she'd glimpsed through the rain. Her bullet had driven it away, at least temporarily, But where had it gone? She crouched and peered through the gap, scanning the yard for footprints. Sure enough, muddy depressions crisscrossed the clearing, each larger than a wolf's tracks, with strange grooves that suggested elongated claws. Her heart thumped as she recalled the vicious blow to the door. Whatever it was, it must be wounded, maybe bleeding. She told herself that might keep it from coming back, but she wasn't confident. Some predators grew more erratic when injured and cornered. Returning to the main room, Lucy tugged her cell phone from her pocket and clicked it on. The battery indicator glowed green enough to grant her a few minutes of potential signal searching. She walked in slow circles, lifting the device toward the ceiling, but the bars remained stubbornly absent. It was no surprise. She rarely had decent reception on clear days, let alone after a storm that likely toppled towers and phone lines alike. With a sigh, she pocketed the phone and approached the Bobcat again. It flattened its ears, tense, but did not move away. Lucy knelt and inched the new bandages forward. "I need to change that dressing," she murmured, more to soothe herself than the cat. Carefully, she unwrapped the damp gauze and dabbed the wound with antiseptic. The Bobcat trembled, letting out a faint hiss, yet stayed put. Lucy felt the warmth of its body beneath her hands, a startling reminder that this was no mere figment of the storm's madness. It was a living creature, dependent on her mercy for the moment. Once the fresh bandage was secure, Lucy shifted her attention to the collar. In the half-light, she could make out ragged edges and letters imprinted along the underside. She leaned closer, squinting, mindful to keep her face out of swiping range. The letters seemed partially worn away, leaving only a few that were fully legible, BARC, and a faded number sequence. She'd heard of research organizations tagging wild animals, but typically they used more durable materials or small radio transmitters. This collar looked almost homemade, with crude stitching on one side. Could it be from a private sanctuary? She stood and walked to the kitchen, turning over the puzzle in her mind. The kettle was where she left it, still half-filled from the previous night. Exhaustion now gripped her fiercely, her nerves frayed from the all-night vigil. Deciding she needed at least a little comfort, she heated the water and brewed a strong cup of tea. Between the rising steam and the pungent scent, she found a small measure of calm. She leaned against the counter, gazing at the Bobcat. It had closed its eyes again, perhaps lulled by the relative stillness. With dawn creeping forward, Lucy knew her next move had to be either venturing out in search of help or waiting, locked in isolation, until the storm fully passed. The second option felt safer in the immediate sense. She had supplies for a few days, and she could tend the Bobcat's injury here. But if that monstrous creature roamed the woods nearby, she worried about it returning once it recovered from the bullet wound. The battered door offered almost no defense should it attack again. On the other hand, trekking through mud-slick roads in a failing jeep was its own gamble. If she got stuck, she'd be even more vulnerable. She found herself hesitating, uncertain which risk was greater. Perhaps she could try the old shortwave radio her grandfather had left behind. Although she hadn't used it in years, it might still work if the antenna was intact. Throwing on a raincoat, she ventured to the small workshop attached to the side of the cabin. The floor was strewn with sawdust, the air tinged with the musty smell of rusted tools. In the corner, beneath tarps and a stack of defunct motors, she unearthed the battered metal case that held the radio. A flicker of hope touched her as she set the radio on a makeshift workbench and plugged it into the extension cord that ran from the cabin's generator. She flicked switches, listening to the machine crackle to life. Static filled the air, loud enough to make her jump. She adjusted the dials carefully, scanning the frequencies for any sign of human voice. Though it took several attempts, at last she picked up a faint but distinct signal. It faded in and out, laced with interference, but she caught what sounded like the local ranger station's call letters. Her pulse quickened, and she leaned toward the mic. "Ranger Station, this is Lucy Harding, about 8 miles north of mile marker 42. Is anyone there? She released the talk button and waited. For a moment, only static. Then, a muffled voice broke through, its words fuzzy but recognizable. "Reading you, Lucy. Storm knocked out most lines. You okay?" Relief flooded her. She pressed the button again, fighting the static. "I'm safe, but I've got an injured bobcat here and something attacked the house last night. It broke down my door. I shot it, but I don't know what it was. It's not a bear or a wolf. The door's heavily damaged. I need help." She released the button, fear surging anew at the thought of describing the creature. The ranger's reply was choppy, but she made out references to road washouts and limited manpower. She heard him say, "We'll be careful, morning patrol." Then the signal dissolved into white noise. Lucy tried again to reach him, but no luck. The last coherent phrase repeated in her mind, "Be careful." The rangers might arrive, but there was no telling how long it would take. She trudged back into the main house, radio tucked under her arm, determined not to lose that tenuous connection if it reappeared. The bobcat blinked up at her, tail twitching. The day felt brighter now, yet the pall of danger weighed heavily. Lucy exhaled, scanning her surroundings. She might still have time to fortify the place. If the rangers couldn't come right away, she'd have to rely on her own ingenuity. She chugged the last of her tea and set the cup aside, then moved to gather nails, boards, and any extra lumber stored out back. Working in the drizzle, she could shore up the damaged door and windows, at least enough to slow any new assault. Lucy worked her way around the cabin's exterior with single-minded focus, boots sinking into mud as she pulled warped planks from the small storage shed. Her hands shook from a combination of fatigue and lingering terror, but she forced them steady enough to grip the hammer. The rainfall had slowed to a weak drizzle, yet every rumble of distant thunder set her nerves on edge. She strained her ears, listening for any sign of movement in the soaked underbrush, but all she heard was water dripping from the eaves and the moan of the wind through the pines. Back in the mudroom, she knelt to align a board over the splintered gap near the doorknob. The wood was old, but it was better than leaving a gaping hole. With every swing of the hammer, she recalled the sheer force that had burst through the original door last night. It felt surreal to believe a single bullet was enough to banish the looming menace she'd barely glimpsed. Exhaustion made her movements clumsy, and once or twice she smashed her thumb with the hammer, biting back yelps of pain so as not to alarm the bobcat. Blood pulsed beneath her throbbing nail, but she kept hammering until the new barrier fit snug against the battered frame. When she stepped back to assess her handiwork, water dripped from her hair, trickling cold along the back of her neck. The door hardly looked pretty. Boards overlapped at odd angles, nails jutted askew. But it should at least hold against weak pressure. Her gaze swept across the muddy footprints in the yard. The monstrous shape from the night before had left more than just footprints. Deep gouges in the earth suggested it dug in with powerful limbs. She had to hope its injuries would discourage any immediate return. Inside, she found the bobcat awake but trembling. One of its front paws flexed anxiously against the floor, claws scraping at the boards. The cat's ears perked at every sound, and Lucy spotted tension rippling through its body whenever thunder boomed. She placed the makeshift first aid kit on the table, decided to brew a fresh pot of tea to calm her own frazzled nerves, then realized she should offer water or some kind of nourishment to the bobcat. Animals could go a while without food, but its condition was dire enough that every meal might help. She poured a bit of warm water into a shallow bowl and slid it gently toward the cat. Next, she opened a can of tuna, normally destined for her own emergency pantry, and placed it on a small plate near the bandaged feline. The bobcat sniffed warily, ears twitching in distrust. Lucy retreated to give it space. She busied herself with checking the shortwave radio again, turning the dial until static crackled. After a few minutes of painstaking adjustment, she managed to hear a faint snippet of a ranger's voice. The interference was worse than before, likely from residual storm clouds. Despite repeated attempts, she couldn't get more than a scattered syllable or two. With a frustrated sigh, she switched the radio off to conserve power. Returning to the main room, she noticed the tuna had been partially eaten, and the bobcat now lapped the water with slow, deliberate motions. The tension in its posture remained, yet Lucy felt a flicker of relief that it trusted her offering enough to accept. She remembered the half-legible letters on the collar. BARC. Could it be an acronym for a remote wildlife rehabilitation center? Her curiosity mingled with worry. Someone out there had either studied or cared for this cat, and clearly it had escaped something dreadful. The savage claw marks on its flank told only part of the story. Lucy rummaged through her grandfather's old files, kept in a battered metal cabinet by the fireplace. He'd been a woodsman and amateur naturalist, and she recalled seeing pamphlets or bulletins from conservation groups in his collection. She hoped, however slim the chance, to find a reference to an organization with initials like BARC. A swirl of dust rose as she flipped through weathered documents, scanning titles: Montana Wildlife Fund, Eastern Range Timber Preservation, Project Links. Nothing jumped out at her. She gently closed the cabinet, coughing at the stirred dust. Outside, the sky had grown lighter, though thick, grey clouds still blanketed the horizon. Lucy returned to the window and surveyed the yard, searching for any hint of movement. A weak sunbeam struggled through, illuminating the debris-littered clearing. No new footprints marred the muddy ground. She swallowed, trying to shake off the unsettling memory of that huge silhouette. With no phone signal and minimal radio contact, she was stuck waiting for the rangers to arrive, assuming they could navigate the washed-out roads. A sudden hiss behind her made her spin around. The bobcat had lurched to its feet, ears flattened, its tail flicked in agitation. Lucy tensed, wondering if it was about to attack. Then she realized the cat's gaze was fixed on something behind her. Heart pounding, she followed its line of sight to the half-shuttered window near the fireplace. At first, Lucy saw nothing but dripping branches. Then, in a gust of wind, something emerged from behind the trunk of a downed spruce, an enormous shape, low to the ground, prowling at the edge of the clearing. Fear constricted Lucy's chest. She reached for the rifle, leaning against the wall, every muscle taut. The shape moved slowly, almost limping. Whatever the creature was, it appeared injured, likely from her bullet. She sidled toward the window, keeping her head low. The bobcat let out another warning hiss, but made no move to flee. Through the streaked glass, Lucy caught a glimpse of coarse, matted fur, a color that was neither purely brown nor gray. A deep gash along its shoulder glistened with fresh blood, confirming she'd grazed it the night before. She fought to steady her breathing as she angled the barrel of the rifle toward the window. She could attempt another shot, but the distance and her limited vantage made a clean hit unlikely. More importantly, she had no idea how many rounds she had left. She couldn't recall how many times she'd fired in the chaos. Unwilling to waste ammunition on a risky shot, Lucy lowered the rifle slightly, choosing instead to watch. The creature remained at the tree line, hunched. A sense of intelligence radiated from its slow, deliberate movements. Even from inside, she could feel a hateful awareness in the way it angled its head toward the cabin. With a sudden burst of effort, it lurched deeper into the woods, disappearing among the wet foliage. Lucy exhaled in a trembling rush, lowering the rifle completely. She wanted to believe it had retreated for good, but a gnawing intuition warned otherwise. An injured predator in unfamiliar territory might escalate its behavior, especially if hunger or desperation drove it on. The bobcat's fur stood on end, and it continued to stare long after the shape was gone. Lucy let out a shaky breath, then moved to the radio again, twisting dials with renewed urgency. She managed a fragment of static-laced speech, flooded, "can't," before it dissolved into a faint hum. So the Rangers were dealing with their own emergencies, likely spread thin across the region. She was on her own for now, forced to rely on her meager defenses and whatever stroke of luck had so far kept her alive. Lucy waited a full 15 minutes before daring to lower the rifle for more than a heartbeat. She stared out the window, eyes straining to detect any flicker of movement in the dripping forest. The creature had vanished, but her intuition screamed that it still lurked somewhere nearby, nursing its wound and plotting its next move. The bobcat likewise seemed uneasy. Even though it no longer hissed, it remained alert, ears swiveled toward the windows. Lucy's breath came shallow and rapid, her body running on the fumes of frayed nerves and a single cup of tea. Eventually, she forced herself to move. She set the rifle gently against the wall within easy reach and walked over to check the shortwave radio once more. Static crackled into the still air, and she methodically twisted the dial, scanning for the ranger station signal. Nothing. A spike of frustration tore through her. The roads were likely impassable, the lines down, and the rangers stretched thin by storm damage across the county. She was alone. Sensing she had no immediate backup, Lucy realized she needed a plan for the long haul. The cabin had limited resources, and her improvised barricade wouldn't deter a determined assault. The memory of that monstrous form smashing the door made her shudder. The bullet wound must have slowed it, yet there was no telling how gravely it was injured, or how much fight it still possessed. She looked around the living room, mentally cataloguing her options. A few thick blankets, some spare tools, the old hunting rifle with a handful of shells. She had enough canned goods to last a couple of weeks if she rationed carefully. The generator was running low on fuel, though, and driving to town felt like madness unless absolutely necessary. Her jeep might handle mud, but not deep floodwaters. The bobcat watched her from the corner as though trying to interpret her movements. The bandage around its flank had stayed in place for the last few hours, but the wound needed more thorough attention if infection was to be avoided. She remembered the half-obscured letters on the collar, BARC, plus a series of numbers. If only she could identify the facility or group it belonged to, maybe they could explain why this cat was out here. A half-formed thought nagged at her. What if the monstrous creature in the forest was somehow related to the same project? A research experiment gone wrong? Or something equally bizarre? The idea seemed far-fetched, but the entire night had defied logic. Gritting her teeth, Lucy decided the bobcat needed a more private, comfortable space to heal. Leaving it in the drafty main room felt unkind. Plus, if the thing outside decided to try another approach, it would be safer to keep the cat away from windows. Gathering a few stray towels, she slowly approached the animal, whispering soothingly. It tensed, but did not lash out when she draped a towel near its paws. With deliberate gentleness, Lucy coaxed it to its feet. The cat limped badly, favoring one hind leg, likely bruised or strained when it fled into her home. She guided it into a small storage room down the hall. The walls there had no windows, just a sturdy door that latched securely. Inside, she spread blankets and towels on the floor to create a makeshift bed. She placed a fresh bowl of water and another can of tuna beside the nest. The bobcat eyed the new surroundings with a wary expression, but it made no aggressive moves as Lucy backed out of the room, leaving the door cracked for light. Satisfied the cat was at least out of direct danger, Lucy returned to the main room to fortify the windows. She pushed the dining table against the largest one, then nailed planks in a cross pattern over the glass panes. Each hammer blow echoed in her bones. She felt like a doomsday prepper barricading for the apocalypse, but she refused to underestimate the threat outside. Over the next hour, she repeated the process for every window on the ground floor, just enough coverage to deter something from smashing through, but leaving minimal slivers for her to see out. When she finished, her sweat and the lingering dampness of the storm clung to her clothes, and her arms ached from hammering. Still, the effort brought a measure of security. She slumped onto the sofa, letting her head rest against the cushions. For the first time, she noticed the howling wind had mellowed to a sullen breeze, and the steady drum of rain had subsided to an occasional patter. The hush of the post-storm air pressed in around her, heavy with the weight of unasked questions. She closed her eyes. Scenes from the night flashed in her mind, the savage claw marks on her door, the impossible size of that shape, and the wounded Bobcat's desperate entrance. Her grandfather's old words came to her. "Nature has more secrets than we can ever guess, Lucy. Respect them." He had taught her that the forest was no mere backdrop, but a living tapestry, constantly weaving new stories. A soft rustling at the edge of the room made her open her eyes. The Bobcat had ventured from the storage room, apparently unwilling to remain isolated. It padded unsteadily into the living room and paused at the threshold, nose twitching. Lucy raised herself from the sofa, moving slowly so as not to startle it. "It's okay," she murmured, gesturing to the living area, though she knew the cat likely didn't understand her words. Perhaps it simply sensed her calmer demeanor. She eased into the kitchen and opened a cupboard, retrieving another can of tuna. The cat followed, limping on that hind leg, staying just out of arm's reach. Once Lucy set the dish down, the Bobcat lowered its head and ate in swift, hungry gulps. Seeing it devour the food, Lucy felt a pang of sympathy. She'd always admired wild creatures from a respectful distance, photographing them during tranquil morning walks or quietly observing their patterns. Never had she imagined tending to one inside her home, especially not under these circumstances. If fate hadn't intervened, the cat would have been lost to that monstrous pursuer. A sudden swell of static from the radio reminded her she should keep trying for the Rangers. Lucy hurried over to the device, fumbling with the dials. To her surprise, a faint voice crackled through. This time the interference was a little lighter, and she distinctly heard the words, "This is Ranger Holcomb. Road closures. Rescue teams delayed. Anyone receiving, please respond." She lunged for the mic. "Ranger Holcomb, this is Lucy Harding. I'm north of mile marker 42 in the old Harding place." She spoke quickly, forcing her voice calm. "I have an injured bobcat, and there's some sort of huge creature prowling around. I shot it last night, but it's still out there. My place is damaged. I need help." A burst of static answered. Lucy's heart plummeted, certain the signal had dropped. Then Ranger Holcomb's voice came through, broken but discernible. "Lucy, we hear. Roads flooded. Landslide. East route blocked. Could be hours or days. Hold tight. Armed? Protect yourself." She gripped the mic. "I have a rifle. Limited ammo. The creature is large. It tore through my door." Ranger Holcomb's transmission cut in. "Shelter in place. Reinforcements eventually. Stay safe." The line went dead. Lucy exhaled, hugging the radio to her chest. "Stay safe," he'd said, as if it were that simple. Still, she at least knew the Rangers were aware of her situation. That was more than she'd had before. She set the radio aside and reached for the rifle again, her fingers brushing the rough grain of the stock. The next step was to check her ammo. She rummaged in the closet where she'd found the rifle and discovered 2 boxes of shells, one nearly full, the other containing just a handful. Better than she'd feared. Counting them carefully, she determined she had around 15 rounds left. If the creature returned, she wasn't entirely helpless. Outside, the pale light of mid-morning glimmered through the barricaded windows. The storm clouds slowly drifted west, leaving behind a sodden landscape that glistened in watery sunbeams. Lucy steeled herself, torn between relief at the easing weather and dread of what might come next. The bobcat finished its meal and lay down, curling into a wary crouch against the wall. Their vigil continued. Lucy's first instinct after hearing the ranger's fractured message was to gather every supply she could possibly need for the coming days. She couldn't predict how long she might be cut off from outside help, nor when that prowling menace in the woods would strike again. If it had crept back to lick its wounds, there was no guarantee it wouldn't return once desperation set in. She didn't want to risk being caught off guard if the rangers were delayed for more than a single night. She set the rifle aside, still within reach, and rummaged through the kitchen cabinets. There were enough canned vegetables, beans, and soups to last her at least a week, especially if she rationed carefully. She stacked them into a corner near the fireplace, creating a small pantry within arm's reach. A large jug of water went beside them, along with a tin of tea bags and an old metal kettle. She made sure the first aid kit was accessible. Then she paused, eyeing the bobcat curled near the wall. It lay awake, but unmoving, its eyes following her every step, as though uncertain whether she might turn on it. She grabbed another bowl, filled it with water, and gently placed it a few feet from the cat. It blinked, nostrils flaring, then lowered its head to drink. With each small gesture of trust, Lucy felt a flicker of warmth. She'd always admired wildlife, but never dreamed she'd form such a precarious bond with a wounded bobcat. She glanced at its collar again, frustration nagging at her. If she only knew what BARC stood for, maybe the reason behind the cat's presence and that horrifying creature would become clearer. Between hammering nails to reinforce more of the interior doors, she collected her grandfather's old field guides and tried to recall any mention of local research stations. There was a place called Briarwood Animal Research Conservancy, though she wasn't sure it still existed. It had been rumored to deal with exotic or endangered species, but she'd never met anyone who worked there. If BARC was an acronym for Briarwood, that might be the connection. She jotted down a note on a scrap of paper. Her next step would be finding a way to confirm that link, perhaps by radioing the rangers again, hoping they had a directory of local wildlife organizations. A growl outside snapped her from her thoughts. Heart thumping, she rushed to the window and peered through the narrow gap in the makeshift barricade. Nothing in sight, just the battered clearing and dripping pines. The storm seemed to have finally ended. Patches of pale sky peeked between ragged clouds, and sunlight grazed the treetops. Yet the uneasy hush in the air refused to dissipate. She suspected that whatever roamed the woods was still close. For the next hour, Lucy busied herself organizing the few parts of the house still intact. She double-checked the load in her rifle, ensuring the rounds were seated properly. She practiced lifting, aiming, and bracing herself against a wall, anything to keep her mind alert. Now and then, she'd hear a distant crack of branches or a low, guttural noise echo through the trees, stirring dread in her core. But each time she looked, the clearing remained empty. Eventually, her gaze drifted to the bobcat, whose eyes had closed in tentative rest. Realizing she hadn't eaten more than a bite of toast since the night before, Lucy rummaged in her supplies and prepared a quick meal of canned beans. She sat on the sofa to eat, forcing down each spoonful despite having no appetite. She found herself listening intently for the telltale snap of twigs. The quiet forest unsettled her almost as much as the howling storm had. A sudden scuffle of claws on floorboards made her freeze, spoon half raised. The bobcat had risen to its feet, limping forward. It approached Lucy with cautious steps, ears still half flattened, as though every instinct warned it not to trust. She held still, hardly daring to breathe. The cat sniffed at her boots, then turned its head to the side, revealing the torn collar more clearly. Lucy wondered if it was offering her the chance to investigate. Slowly, she set her bowl aside and pulled a multi-tool from her pocket. "It's okay," she murmured. She doubted it understood, but the soft tone seemed to calm it. She edged closer, gently flipping the collar's edge to see if there was more text. Through the dirt and dried blood, she could make out a faint BRWDARC, like additional letters had been worn away. The final numbers read 2703, though they meant nothing to her. The cat tensed under her touch, but didn't swipe as though too exhausted to resist. Briarwood Animal Research Conservancy. That had to be it. Lucy's mind spun. She pictured an old rumor about questionable experiments or genetically modified animals. It sounded more like local legend than reality. But if the stories were even partly true, maybe this bobcat wasn't the only creature that had escaped. Maybe the monstrous thing out there was another product of clandestine breeding or manipulation, now on the loose. It would explain the unnatural size and the savage violence. The bobcat twitched, growling softly as Lucy withdrew her hand. Clearly, it had tolerated enough inspection for now. Lucy let it limp away, pondering her next move. Briarwood lay 2 valleys over, if she remembered correctly. Reaching it would require crossing a series of back roads likely washed out by the storm. She didn't know if the staff even remained at that site or if the place had been abandoned years ago. But if any facility had knowledge of bizarre wildlife or violent predators, that seemed a logical place to look for answers. She returned to the radio, knuckles white on the dial, and called for the ranger station once more. Static answered, then a faint flicker of a response. She tried to speak, but the interference devoured her words. She hissed in frustration. She wanted to mention Briarwood, to ask if the rangers had logs of that place. But no matter how she angled the antenna, no matter which frequency she tried, all she managed were faint pops and crackles. With a curse, she switched it off. Resigned, Lucy moved to the window again. She mulled the idea of attempting a trip to Briarwood on foot. 8 or 9 miles might be manageable under normal conditions, but with roads underwater and a monstrous creature lurking, it seemed reckless. The jeep could cover distance faster, but again, the path might be impassable. And if the creature was out there, Lucy would be an easy target on the narrow trails. She sighed, resting her forehead against the barricade. At least for tonight, her best bet was to remain in the cabin. Maybe by morning, the rangers would have cleared a path or established a better radio signal. Once she confirmed that it was indeed Briarwood behind the collar, she might approach them for guidance. Then she recalled the savage gouges in her door, the memory of that hulking shape. She prayed it wouldn't grow desperate enough to test her makeshift fortress again at dusk. Glancing at the bobcat, Lucy decided to check its bandage once more. The cat sat near the fireplace, head drooping. She approached, careful to keep her movements slow and predictable, and lowered herself to one knee. The bandage was stained but not fully soaked through. She placed a hand gently on the cat's flank, feeling the tension in its muscles. "You've been through a lot," she whispered, voice trembling. The bobcat made a soft sound, neither a purr nor a growl, just a weary exhalation of breath. Focusing on the routine of care gave Lucy a small sense of purpose, a reminder that she had skills enough to manage in this crisis. Yet as the afternoon light slipped behind looming clouds, she couldn't shake the sense that time was running out. Each drip from the eaves, each snap of a branch outside, felt like a countdown toward the moment the forest's hidden terror might show its face again. Lucy lingered near the fireplace, letting the warmth soothe her tired muscles. The afternoon light had shifted, painting the barricaded windows with a wan glow. Every so often, she glanced at the bobcat resting nearby, its tail flicking in what seemed like anxious anticipation. Outside, the forest had settled into an eerie calm, as if nature itself were holding its breath. She told herself she was merely being cautious, but in truth, she feared leaving the safety of the cabin even to gather more firewood. The supply on the porch had been soaked through by the storm. If dusk fell and the temperature dropped, she'd have to burn what remained in the small indoor stack. She considered venturing out for drier logs, yet each time she contemplated opening the door, her thoughts flashed back to the splintered wood and how easily the creature had breached it. Looking down at her boots, she tried to weigh the risks. The forest might be empty, The monster long gone, or it could be hiding just beyond the tree line, waiting for her to step outside. Rationally, she realized she couldn't remain cooped up indefinitely. The rangers had implied it could be days before help arrived. Worse, the roads might remain impassable for a week. Gathering her courage, Lucy slipped on her coat and swung the rifle strap over her shoulder. She decided a quick sweep around the cabin's perimeter, just to check for fresh tracks, was worth the gamble. Before she left, she approached the bobcat. Its spotted fur looked less matted now, thanks to intermittent grooming. The animal's wound was still bandaged, and while its breathing appeared steadier, Lucy could see that its back leg remained stiff. "Stay here," she whispered, though she knew it couldn't grasp her words. Somehow, saying them aloud made her feel more resolute. She unlatched the door, carefully pulling it open against her haphazard barricade, and peered outside. The sky was a watery blue, with only a few grey clouds drifting across it. A fleeting patch of sunshine lit the yard, illuminating the scattered branches and puddles left behind by the storm. Lucy scanned the tree line for any movement. Nothing. The forest was hushed, as if it too anxiously awaited her decision. Shouldering the rifle, she took one step onto the sodden porch, the boards creaking beneath her weight. Her nose wrinkled at the lingering scent of wet wood and earth. She surveyed the muddy ground in front of the broken door. The footprints left by the creature were still visible, deep gouges in the dirt where it must have braced itself during the attack. Lucy's stomach lurched at the memory of that colossal force slamming against her home. But as she studied the tracks more carefully, she noted something new. Smaller, bloodied prints heading into the woods. It had indeed limped away. She found no evidence of a return. Keeping her rifle ready, Lucy descended the porch steps. Each step made her heart hammer. She inched toward the nearest stack of firewood, testing the ground with each footfall. The sun dipped behind a passing cloud, draping everything in a sudden gloom. She tensed, scanning the perimeter, expecting a flash of movement or a low growl. All remained silent. Quickly she gathered several armloads of damp logs, cursing under her breath at their soggy weight. She knew these wouldn't burn well until they dried, but she had to bring them in, give them a chance. Her hands shook from the strain, and she nearly dropped one bundle when a sharp snap echoed in the forest. She froze, breath caught in her throat. After a moment, a lone bird darted across the clearing, startled into flight by something unseen. Lucy hurried back to the porch, loaded with as much wood as she could manage in a single trip. Inside, the bobcat was standing, ears perked. It eyed her return with guarded relief, or so she fancied. Lucy nudged the door shut and dropped the logs in a pile by the fireplace. Her heart still drummed, adrenaline coursing through her. She peered out through the barricaded window, but saw only the quiet yard. She found herself pacing, pulse refusing to slow, mind replaying questions. What if the creature was from Briarwood? Had it tracked the bobcat across miles of forest, intent on recapturing or killing it? She wondered if the bobcat had escaped, leading that monstrous predator on a chase that ended at her door. Perhaps the cat had no idea it was bringing its pursuer directly to Lucy's home. None of it explained the savage violence, though. If it were merely a case of recapture, why tear through a house? Exhausted by speculation, Lucy finally made herself sit. She leaned the rifle within arm's reach and drew a small blanket over her lap. The bobcat watched from a distance, amber eyes reflecting the flickering firelight. For a long time, they regarded each other across the modest living room, two wary survivors of a terrifying night. She reached for the shortwave radio again, flipping it on out of habit more than hope. The static rose and fell in wavering currents. Twisting the dial, she picked up a faint voice. It sounded official, possibly the Rangers, but the words were too garbled to decipher. She tried calling out, repeating her location, but the signal bled away. With a resigned sigh, she powered down and pushed the radio aside. She was on her own for another night at least. Hunger prodded her, and she moved to heat a simple meal of broth on the stove. The gas lines still worked, fortunately, so she could cook. She realized the bobcat might also be hungry. While the cat's diet normally involved fresh meat, Lucy could offer only more canned tuna. She retrieved a new can from her stores and scooped the contents onto a plate, setting it a short distance from the fireplace. The cat limped over, sniffing carefully before eating. Each time Lucy saw it move, she winced at the stiffness in its leg. In the back of her mind, she mulled whether a few more days of rest would be enough, or if it needed more advanced veterinary care. With the roads impassable, it wasn't an option yet. As the daylight waned, Lucy placed the soggy logs near the hearth so they could dry. She added a couple of drier sticks from her precious indoor stack to the fire, stoking it until dancing flames crackled warmly. That flickering glow provided a small sense of security, warding off the memories of last night's howling darkness. Still, shadows stretched across the ceiling, shifting in shapes that made her skin prickle. She kept thinking about Briarwood, imagining a remote facility on the far side of the valley. Perhaps scientists there worked under strict secrecy, manipulating genetics or housing strange hybrids. The rumors she'd heard as a child had painted it as a place of odd sightings, animals larger or more aggressive than normal. A child's imagination might have embellished those tales, but what if there was truth in them? She pressed her lips into a thin line, determined to discover the facts once she could do so, without risking her life on washed-out roads. The bobcat finished eating and settled onto the towels Lucy had arranged. She felt a surge of relief. The cat's acceptance of her makeshift den signaled it felt at least marginally safe. Tomorrow, Lucy thought, she might try to contact the rangers once more and mention Briarwood specifically. If they confirmed the research center still operated, perhaps they could tell her whether animals had recently escaped. Outside, dusk gathered in earnest. The sky drained of color, leaving behind that peculiar twilight hush. The tall pines stood as silent sentinels, their silhouettes swaying gently in the breeze. Lucy rose from her seat, rifle in hand, to do a final sweep of the windows. Nothing stirred among the lengthening shadows. Still, she refused to assume the danger had passed. After all, it had attacked at night before. She propped the rifle against the arm of the sofa and sat near the bobcat, close enough to feel the fire's heat. They were two reluctant allies, bound by circumstance. The cat breathed slowly, a faint rasp in its throat. Lucy studied the collar once more, reading BRWDARC 2703. Her determination solidified. If morning came without incident, she would do whatever it took to learn the truth behind that faded inscription. Outside, the night air grew colder as the last glimmer of twilight faded behind the pines. Lucy glanced at the dusty clock on the mantel, nearly 9 o'clock. She'd never been one to turn in so early, but exhaustion and tension weighed on her, making every minute feel twice as long. She stifled a yawn, then stood and carefully peered out through the narrow gap in the window barricade. A pale moon slid out from behind a ragged cloud, illuminating the clearing with a silvery light. The yard looked deceptively peaceful, droplets glistening on bent blades of grass, rain-soaked leaves shining like dull mirrors. But Lucy knew that beyond this small patch of calm lay the vast, dark forest, and somewhere in its shadows lurked the wounded predator. Or perhaps, she thought with a twist of guilt, it wasn't truly a predator at all, but a tortured creature, malformed by human meddling. She gripped the windowsill and released a shaky breath, recognizing she might never uncover the truth unless she tracked down someone at Briarwood. Her gaze drifted to the bobcat. It stirred in its sleep, one paw twitching against the towel. Lucy wondered if it dreamt of the open woods, of tasting fresh prey under starlit skies. The collar's presence reminded her that this animal's life might already have been altered by human hands. She hoped that once it healed, she could at least return it to a semblance of freedom, assuming, of course, that the creature from the forest didn't reclaim its quarry first. Weariness tugged at her thoughts. She realized that if she planned to remain vigilant until dawn, she couldn't let herself fully drift off. The sensible option was to take brief naps, rifle close by, until the grey light of morning. She checked the shortwave radio one last time. Static. No words. Grimacing, she switched it off, wary of draining the battery further. She settled onto the sofa, propping her back against a cushion and laying the rifle across her lap. The fire crackled softly. Now and then, a stray ember popped, making her flinch. She kept her ears open for any rustle or scrape outside. At first, every minor creak of the house set her heart pounding, but gradually her eyelids grew heavy. She fought sleep, letting her mind wander to memories of safer nights in this very house, nestled in the countryside, storms raging harmlessly beyond thick walls. Nothing had ever threatened her here, until now. A few minutes later, she jolted awake to a strange sound in the distance, a noise that set her nerves aflame. It was a deep, resonant growl echoing through the trees. Lucy's pulse quickened and she lifted the rifle, scanning the interior for the bobcat. The cat's head was up, ears tilted, eyes wide and alert. They waited, breath held in unison, for the growl to repeat. When it did, it sounded closer, perhaps at the edge of the clearing. Lucy forced herself to her feet, knees trembling. She pressed her face to the barricade slat, peering out at the moonlit yard. A patchwork of shadows stretched across the wet grass. For several long moments nothing moved, then she spotted it, a hulking shape prowling along the periphery, half concealed behind the skeletal remains of a fallen spruce. Her heart hammered at the familiar outline, hunched shoulders, elongated limbs, each step filled with deliberate caution. She inhaled sharply, leveling the rifle. A sense of dread twisted in her gut. She had hoped that the bullet wound and daylight would have persuaded it to stay away. But there it was, circling the perimeter like an apex hunter sizing up its prey. Perhaps its injuries still bled, or perhaps they had only enraged it further. Through the barricade, Lucy could glimpse patches of matted fur and a dark stain that might be fresh blood. The sight of that massive silhouette confirmed it meant to keep watch through the night. Time seemed to stretch. Lucy couldn't hear her own breathing, only the frantic thump of her pulse and the low snarling drifting from the beast. Her eyes watered from the strain of trying to keep it in focus through the narrow gap. She debated whether to fire a warning shot. A miss might provoke it, and she didn't want to waste precious ammo unless it charged the house. The bobcat let out a low, menacing hiss, as if trying to warn the intruder. The larger creature froze, angling its head toward the cabin. Even from a distance, Lucy sensed the chill of its predatory gaze. In a burst of sudden movement, it loped several yards closer, halting just beyond the reach of the moonlight, where the yard dipped into shadows. Lucy's breath caught, rifle clutched tight. She aimed, finger edging onto the trigger, but the creature did not charge. Instead, it settled on its haunches and issued a guttural snort. In the quiet, Lucy caught the faint scrape of claws on wet leaves. She held her position, every muscle taut, waiting for the monstrous shape to either retreat or commit. But after several agonizing seconds, it slunk backward into the gloom. The bobcat hissed again, shifting uneasily. Lucy eased her finger off the trigger, still aiming at the same spot. Nothing else moved. Slowly, as if lulled by some unspoken stalemate, the forest fell silent. Even with the creature out of sight, Lucy's heart still raced, hands unsteady. She hovered by the window for what felt like an eternity, rifle barrel pointed at the place where the beast had stood. Gradually, it sank in that the standoff was over, for the moment. She lowered the gun, air shuddering from her lungs. Outside, the moon slid behind a cloud, casting the clearing into deeper darkness. The cat turned its head, meeting Lucy's gaze. She saw the same fear and determination reflected in those feline eyes. As the hours wore on, Lucy dozed in and out of restless half-sleep on the sofa. She'd awaken every time a branch cracked or the wind sighed, rifle gripped in trembling hands. Occasionally she'd creep to the window to check for any sign of the intruder. Once, she thought she spied a flash of eyes near the trees, but when she blinked, they were gone. The only constant was the faint crackle of the fire and the bobcat's shallow breathing. She wondered if the cat's heightened senses could detect the monster skulking out there better than she could. When the first faint streaks of dawn touched the eastern sky, Lucy felt a surge of hope. The creature had seemed to prefer darkness, or at least used it for cover. Perhaps sunrise would force it to retreat further. She roused herself fully, stiff limbs protesting, and checked the barricaded windows. The yard was still empty, the pines swaying in a pale morning breeze. She risked moving to the mudroom to check for footprints outside. Through the tiny gap, she saw no fresh tracks in the mud, only the same scattered impressions. Exhausted, she collapsed into a chair, rifle in hand. She knew she couldn't endure many more nights like this. Something had to give. Her best option was to reach Briarwood, or at least confirm whether they housed such creatures. If they did, they had a responsibility to contain it. But setting out alone, Bobcat in tow, seemed impossible. Even if she left the cat behind, she'd be vulnerable on the roads. Torn by indecision, Lucy looked at the shortwave radio. Maybe with the new day, the reception would improve. Lucy rubbed her gritty eyes as the morning light strengthened behind the ragged pines. She had kept watch for hours, afraid of drifting into deeper sleep and missing any renewed assault. Outside, dawn revealed a colorless landscape, all mud and fallen branches. Her barricades remained intact, though the battered door looked worse in daylight. The bobcat lay curled on its towels, ears twitching whenever a twig snapped in the breeze. Lucy forced herself to her feet, bones aching with fatigue, and moved to the shortwave radio. The least she could do was attempt contact again, hoping the ranger station might be clearer in the early sun. She flicked the switches, heart thumping at each hiss of static. Then a tinny voice emerged, cutting through interference. "Ranger Holcomb, North Sector, check in, over." Lucy seized the mic, speaking with forced calm. "This is Lucy Harding, near mile marker 42. That creature returned last night. My house is secure, but I still need help." There was a tense pause. Then Ranger Holcomb's voice crackled back. "Lucy, we have partial access to the northwest route. Could reach you by midday if conditions hold. We also received an inquiry from Briarwood Animal Research Conservancy, something about a missing subject." Lucy's pulse spiked. She pressed the button. "I have an injured bobcat with a BRWD-ARC collar, and there is a large, violent creature. Could it be theirs?" Static crackled. "Stay put until we arrive," Holcomb managed, and the signal faded. Elation and dread mingled in Lucy's chest. The rangers were coming, and Briarwood evidently knew something. She shot a glance at the bobcat, which blinked slowly. If the monstrous beast belonged to the same facility, she wanted answers. What had they created, and how had it escaped? All her suspicions about experimental wildlife came flooding back. Rubbing her clammy palms on her jeans, she decided to prepare for the possibility that more than rangers might appear. Perhaps Briarwood staff, eager to reclaim their projects. By mid-morning, Lucy spotted dust rising on the distant logging road. Though the path was half flooded, she slung her rifle over her shoulder and unlocked the cabin door, stepping onto the soggy porch. Two green and brown ranger trucks rumbled into view, tires churning muddy ruts. Relief swept through her as uniformed figures climbed out. Leading them was Ranger Holcomb, a tall woman with a stern expression. Behind her strode a wiry man in civilian clothes who wore a Briarwood ID badge. He eyed Lucy's barricaded windows with anxious intensity. "Ma'am," Holcomb said, voice taut with concern, "are you hurt?" Lucy shook her head, though her eyes stung with relief. "No, but my door is wrecked and something massive tried to get in. The Bobcat is inside, wounded. You mentioned a missing subject from Briarwood? The wiry man stepped forward, adjusting his glasses. Dr. Weldon, Briarwood Animal Research. We lost 2 test animals during last month's storm. One is a genetically modified bobcat we tagged for enhanced cognition studies. Lucy frowned, protective anger flaring. Enhanced cognition? You kept it caged. Dr. Weldon hesitated. It was an experimental line, but the second animal was far more problematic. An unreleased hybrid designed for advanced muscle growth. Holcomb's brow furrowed. You are saying the monster prowling these woods is your second test subject? Weldon nodded grimly. We call it Project H-27. We never intended it to leave the compound. The storm knocked down our security fences, and it escaped. We suspect it has been tracking the bobcat across miles of forest. The ranger's jaw tightened. You realize you are responsible for any harm caused? That beast attacked Lucy's home. Weldon's face paled. We did not anticipate that level of aggression. Lucy could barely contain her outrage. Your creation nearly killed us. Fix it. Weldon swallowed. We brought tranquilizer rifles calibrated to H-27's physiology. If we can locate and subdue it, we can prevent further harm. Lucy glanced toward the tree line, remembering those massive claw marks. It is out there somewhere, hurt. It lurked around last night. Holcomb ordered her team to spread out and scan the perimeter. The rangers donned protective vests, while Dr. Weldon readied a bulky dart gun. Lucy insisted on joining them, rifle in hand. She refused to cower inside, while strangers hunted the beast that had terrorized her for 2 nights. They began a cautious sweep, trudging through the sodden clearing. The bobcat, too weak to protest, remained in the cabin. Lucy prayed the battered door would hold. Dawn mist curled among the pines, cloaking the undergrowth in ghostly veils. Ranger Holcomb led the way, scanning for footprints or fresh blood. Dr. Weldon moved awkwardly, wincing at every snap of a twig. Lucy wondered if the man comprehended the gravity of creating such a creature and releasing it, however inadvertently, into the wild. They found tracks near the forest edge, large paw prints, half slurred in mud. Splashes of dark red suggested the wound still bled. The trail led deeper into the trees, weaving around clumps of ferns and moss-slick rocks. The hush felt suffocating. Lucy kept her rifle raised, though her hands shook each time she remembered the monstrous silhouette. The group advanced slowly, picking through the dripping foliage. At intervals, Dr. Weldon paused to check readings on a handheld device. We implanted a locator chip, he explained, voice hushed. When it is within 50 yards, I might pick up a signal. Suddenly, a low growl rolled through the pines, making them freeze. Lucy's heart thundered. The underbrush ahead rippled and a shape emerged. Enormous shoulders, misshapen limbs, fur matted with blood. H-27. Its eyes glowed with feral hostility as it bared impressive teeth. Dr. Weldon fumbled with the dart gun, and Lucy realized with horror that he had not already loaded a dart. Holcomb's rangers lifted their own rifles, but the angle was poor. The creature snarled, stepping sideways, as if seeking an opening to lunge. Instinct seized Lucy. She steadied her weapon, firing one shot into the ground near its feet. Dirt sprayed up, startling the beast. It recoiled, momentarily confused. Holcomb shouted, "Now, Weldon!" The scientist struggled to load and aim, but H-27 recovered fast, letting out a roar that shook Lucy's bones. It lowered its head, preparing to charge. The rangers fired, but their bullets only grazed its dense musculature. With terrifying speed, it sprang toward Dr. Weldon, jaws snapping. Lucy pivoted, heart pounding, and squeezed off another round. Her bullet struck the creature's shoulder, twisting it off balance. Still it lunged, claws slashing at Weldon's arm. He cried out, stumbling backward into wet leaves. Seizing her last chance, Lucy aimed carefully. Her shot rang out, catching H-27 in the flank. It bellowed in rage, just as Weldon fired his dart gun at close range. The tranquilizer dart embedded in the creature's neck. For a heartbeat, it seemed unaffected. Then its roar wavered, limbs trembling as the drug took hold. It collapsed in a twitching heap, breath rasping. Blood oozed from its wounds, and Lucy felt a jolt of conflicting emotions, relief, pity, revulsion, surging at once. Holcomb and her rangers approached cautiously, guns trained. Dr. Weldon pressed a hand to his torn sleeve, grimacing at a shallow gash. "It needs immediate medical intervention," he gasped, kneeling beside the fallen monster. "But we can sedate and transport it." He looked at Lucy, eyes flooded with gratitude and guilt. "Thank you for saving my life." Lucy merely nodded, chest heaving. They'd subdued the beast, but at a cost. She turned back toward the cabin, mind already on the injured Bobcat. If Briarwood had caused this entire nightmare, what would they do with the smaller feline? She resolved to make sure the cat would not be caged again. It deserved better than that. At the tree line, the sun's rays pierced the lingering mist, illuminating the monstrous shape lying in sedation. Ranger Holcomb signaled for a medevac team, and Lucy slung her rifle over her shoulder. She was done fighting. They returned to the cabin together. As Lucy stepped inside, the Bobcat lifted its head. She knelt by its side, stroking its damp fur and whispering soft reassurances. Behind her, Dr. Weldon spoke quietly, promising better care for the Bobcat and immediate containment for H-27. Lucy pressed her cheek to the cat's uninjured flank, relief washing over her. In time, the monstrous creation would be dealt with, the wounds mended, and the strange chapters of this storm-born terror would fade into memory. For now, both she and the Bobcat could finally rest, safe in the dawn's promise.